Hello everyone, Gabe here from the Uplay team, and I am joined by
Isai Simonet, aka Truthman from Overclocking TV.
And today we're going to talk to you about overclocking your Intel CPU.
While performance tuning is one way to get more FPS and more performance out of the hardware you already have, with some simple tweaks. So we're just gonna get into that and do it the simplest and safest way.
So overclocking or performance tuning is pushing your hardware past its intended boundaries, so you may be voiding your warranty. Just be aware of that and do everything at your own risk. That being said, we are going to take you through the safest and simplest ways, as Zahi mentioned, and we'll also talk to you about the different limits you can hit and how you can really adjust that to get the most out of your hardware.
Keep in mind there's a lot of different ways to do it. This is just one way we think would be easiest for everyone watching the video.
So, let's get into some Intel fun.
Let's get with Intel. So we'll see the basics of overclocking your Intel CPU. So performance tuning is either up or down for efficiency, up for overclocking. What we're gonna try to do is to make it the simplest way for you guys to get a little performance boost into your platform. There's multiple ways to do it. Obviously, there's a risk associated with it. We're gonna take the simplest one and the most easiest one for you to do. The first thing we will do and we'll need is to know what is the hardware you have. So what is the hardware that we have today?
So we have a 9700K, 16 gigs RAM. I don't remember the speed. I'm looking at
DDR4 3600.
Yep, and an Asus Z390 motherboard.
Okay, we have the power. We have a 1000 watt power supply, which is way more than what we need. And we have a cooler that is I think Corsair H150i Pro RGB.
RGB, very important.
So he has a all-in-one cooler. So this is already like from the top end of the kind of cooler you can get on the regular PC. We'll see if we run into some limitation. On the software side, what we need is Intel Extreme Tuning Utility, so XTU, and CPU-Z as well. You will see that there is a different way of testing the stability for your system. Once again, we'll try to keep it the simplest way for you to understand that. You can test with any of the games that you want as well.
I think we're going to do The Division, Far Cry, and For Honor.
I'm going to try on these ones. All right, step one. We need to check the best performance. So before you start doing anything, you need to know where you're at. To go above something or to increase what you have, you need to have a starting point. What we will do is to open a benchmark. You can do that in XTU, you can do that in any games that you want, the in-game benchmark, or you can use any other synthetic benchmark for that. First thing we'll check now is what is the model of our CPU. So we can use CPU-Z, which is a small software that lets you know all the details about your processor and motherboard. So as we can see here, we are using Intel Core i7 9700K, which is right now about 4.5 and 4.9 gigahertz in speed. This is changing because of the turbo mode. We'll come back to that later on. And we can check the memory as well. So the memory, we have 16 gig DDR4, and the memory frequency is at 1066 megahertz, which is not the full speed actually.
No, because we said before that it was actually 3600.
Yeah, so the main reason for that is when you read out the memory from CPU-Z or frequency of the memory, it's actually, you have to double that to find out what is on the marking. So for example, the 1066 will be about 2100-ish, yeah, 2133, something like that. DDR4 2133. This is the rating you will see in the shop. Right now, it's not running at the 3600 that we need because we have not activated XMP.
How do you activate XMP?
This is actually the first step you should do. Before even touching your CPU, activate XMP. Let's not get ahead of yourself as of yet. The first thing we will do is test the base performance that we have. For that, we can use, for example, XTU. There is a tab called benchmarking, which is a benchmark inside the software provided by Intel. It's free software. You can download it on the internet. Look for Intel XTU. I think that's going to be on the description below as well.
But this will give us a really good starting point for kind of how overall our system is performing now, and we'll be able to compare that to later on after we've tweaked some stuff.
The key point here is it's not because you have higher frequency that it's higher in performances. Sometimes there's limitation, auto safety kicking in, so you need to make sure that if you're actually increasing something, you have better performances. So we have a basic score to start with, and this is where we will be starting to build on later on. So step 2, activate XMP. This is a very trivial one, but it might provide one of the most interesting boosts in most of your usage if you're playing games mostly. So what we do is we're just gonna restart the computer and get into the BIOS. To get into the BIOS, super easy, just spam the delete button on your keyboard up until you get into the...
The faster you spam it, the faster you get into BIOS. This may or may not be true fact. It's actually not true.
Here we are in the BIOS. Each BIOS are different depending on your motherboard manufacturer and if you use the easy mode or advanced mode. Right now we're using the BIOS from the Asus motherboard, and it's very easy. We can see directly XMP right here on the left side of the screen, and we can just select, click enable, save and exit, and that's it.
You can see even the settings that you're going to change most of the time.
In most BIOS you'll be able to see what's changed. And here we can see that it's setting the frequency and some timings. So the timings will be like settings that are in terms of performance for your RAM. And we saw as well that the memory voltage was adapted for that.
So we're back.
In the system, let's check what is our frequency now with XMP enable. Look in the memory tab, we have it, 1800 MHz, which is 3600 rating for DDR4. And we can see as well that the timings have been adjusted, and we knew from the BIOS that the voltage have been adjusted to what this memory kit has been sold for. So we know exactly that we are on specification with that. Very easy trick. You will be surprised how many people don't activate this one.
Seems like pretty few buttons, more performance. I don't know what there is to really lose at this point.
Okay, good. We have the frequency, but do we have the performance? So we have to test again with the same benchmark that we used before, and we can compare what happened.
So we're running the benchmark now with the new XMP profile to hopefully see a little bit of an improvement. We'll see what the results end up being. Bam, and there we have it. A little boost.
Nice one. So let's keep pushing. Step 3. We can actually get to the overclocking of the CPU itself. So this is where it's starting to get more interesting in terms of bits and knobs that you have to understand.
One of the first things I noticed actually looking at this is that all the different cores, so we have 8 active cores in this list, but they're not actually all at the same speed. So and you mentioned boost before. So
the turbo boost is an area in which your processor can actually go into. By default, your processor will have a certain frequency, and it can go into that boost frequency whenever needed. What we see on screen is the first 3 cores can go all the way up to 49 multiplier, which results in like 4.9 gigahertz in terms of frequency, if only 1, 2, or 3 cores are used. And then once you go to, for example, 4 and 5 cores, we go to 47. So that's going to be 4.7 gigahertz for all your CPU, etc., with as much as core that you have.
So when your PC is fully stressed, it's not actually running, everything's not actually running at 4.9. Some are running a little bit slower. Exactly.
So this is within the box of the TDP, the thermal design package or power, and this box is basically within that the processor can do it. By default, your processor is actually overclocking itself whenever it needs, as long as it's within specification. So what we will do is to get all the cores at the same speed pretty much all the time. First things we need to do is to basically increase the multiplier to have everything at 49. You can apply that within the system, and that's it. We have actually 4.9 gigahertz now on all our 8 cores.
But now we need to see if it's stable.
We need to see if it's stable, and we need to see if we have actually an improvement in scores.
Yes.
In order to test if it's actually stable and have improvement in score, you can just run a quick benchmark. If you want to stress longer, you can actually just use any stress system that you prefer.
I notice we're hitting something called current limit.
So the current limit throttling is within that box of things that your processor can do. It's saying like, I'm using too much current right now, and this is the current I need to run everything is actually outside of what you allowed me to do. So what we were trying to do is to improve that box of capabilities for the CPU to actually push that limit away. The key point is always to push back the limits as much as you can up until you can't do any limits anymore or you don't feel safe doing it.
So how do we fix this limit?
To fix this limit, super easy. You go back into XTU, so Intel Extreme Tuning Utility. In Advanced Tuning, you have all controls, and you have something called Processor Core ICC Max. This one is the settings that we need to move to have the right things that we're looking for.
So we've done a little bit of pre-testing, so we kind of know what values we need to head to. But generally speaking, I guess increments should be a little bit smaller as you're trying to find the correct value that gives you where you don't hit the limit anymore.
Don't ever take the slider, go all the way up unless you have tested it. I know it's tempting to do, but don't do that because most of the time it won't work. What you have to do is to increase by step of 5 or 10, for example, amps in that specific knobs, or you can use 0.05 or 0.1 volts in terms of increase for voltages, depending on the voltages you are on, obviously.
Since we kind of knew where we wanted to head, that's why you saw us skip ahead a little bit, make this process seem a little bit faster.
And once again, benchmark again and see if you hit that limit. If you still hit that limit. If you still hit that, increase. Keep increasing up until you don't have that limit anymore. We have to get rid of that current limit throttling before we continue increasing the frequency speed of our CPU. We still have it, so we still need to continue. We mingle with the current limits, and in the end we just put it up to the maximum. Don't go straight to the maximum, just go it step by step so you know where it's actually going into your CPU, because every processor is different.
If needed, it's okay to go to the maximum.
Yeah.
So
with these ones, that's fine.
Okay.
The next step will be, there is no limit anymore, so we can keep increasing the frequency. We will go to 50.
Boost.
So keep in mind, at the beginning, our processor will be able to go to only 4.9 gigahertz on 3 cores, not 8 of them. Now we're doing 5 gigahertz on 8 cores, which will be way more demanding for the platform and within that box of things you can do for the CPU.
Apply those settings, and now we run our benchmark to see what happens. A new limit.
So we just increased from one multiplier on 8 cores, and we add the limit, which is called the power limit throttling. So the power limit is the total power that can be used within your CPU. So as we are actually having these limits, it's a very easy limit on Intel to push back. You go in XTU again, and you can just push that limit a little bit higher. You can use the Turbo Boost Short Power Max, which is just for a certain small period of time, or you can just disable this one and have it all the time available. I suggest you disable this feature. Turbo Boost Power Time Window need to be at the maximum, which means that can be on the Turbo Power Boost for a longer period of time. And then this is the Turbo Boost Power Max. This is where we need to mingle with. So once again, go step by step and see if you still hit that limit over time. I would recommend you to go by 20 up until 200, and then you can do 10, 10, 10 all the time. Keep in mind that you have to do the benchmark or stability testing in between. No need to do like 2 hours of stability testing, but the benchmark is a quick way to see if it's working or not.
Now let's see if those adjustments bring us less limits. Have any limits there, but I did notice that we're getting pretty high in the temperature pretty consistently.
So we usually go around like 80 C, like 78, 80 C, which is a nice sweet spot. Don't worry, you can go all the way up to 90 C. That's not really a big problem. It will always depend on the kind of cooling solution that you have, as well as the motherboard. It's reacting with some of the voltages automatically with the settings that we have set up today. And it might be a little bit hotter, it might be a little bit colder. Doesn't really change anything. You have to adapt to your system.
So you said 90 C before was kind of like a safe limit when talking about the benchmark, but what's the actual limit?
So usually if you do an overclocking full time, don't go above 90 C. As a rule of thumb, it's actually a nice limit to have for yourself. And actually there's a safety feature built in the processor that if it's actually going to 100C, it will actually thermal throttle, which is one of the other limits you can hit within that box and this CPU. It will auto adjust itself to not go higher than 100C. So unless you mingle with settings in the BIOS, which we're not seeing here, you should not have this problem.
Cool. What's the next step?
Next step, keep pushing it.
Nice. Push it to the limit. So we're putting everything up to 5.1 now, or 51. I'm going to do our benchmark real quick, see where we end up with that. So that was a crash.
So we did crash before, and what we are trying to see is now is the voltages are not so stable. So when you leave everything in auto, your motherboard will auto adjust the settings by itself, which can fluctuate greatly. The best thing is to actually set up your voltage straight in so you know exactly if it's stable or not.
So how do we do that?
You can open Intel Extreme Tuning utility, and then at the core voltage, you can actually adjust this one. You could adjust the core voltage offset, which is taking the default core voltage and adding a little bit to it, but as every CPU is different, it's very hard to play with. I prefer personally to use the core voltage. You can do 1.2 volts.
What's a safe number to aim for with volts? And you mentioned before going up in really increments of like 0.5. No, not 0.5, 0.05.
0.05. If you go 0.5, that's gonna be a little bit hard.
So small increments of 0.05, but what really is like a safe limit for the core voltage?
So on the latest Intel 9 generation, you can start at 1.2. I would recommend you to start at 1.1 even before you start touching the multiplier. And then if it's crashing, if it's unstable, if you get blue screen, if it freezes your system, just increase by 0.05. And then you can see up until when you have this sweet spot of I can continue pushing my frequency and I can have this lower voltage. Of course, higher voltage mean higher power and everything going to the CPU, so it will become more hot, so you need to dissipate that with a better cooling. So all these limitations are actually within that, that box that we talk about. You might have the power limit, you might have the current limit, you might have a motherboard limit with your VRM, which is the power delivery system. You might have a thermal limit, which is the latest one that we might not run into. Actually, we haven't managed to run into during our testing.
We'll see soon.
And the final limit you can have is the silicon. That means you won't be able to go further within that context. You need to go extreme ways to actually pass that limit if you need to be.
So we've adjusted our core voltage to see what the result is if we crash again. So our benchmark was actually stable. What do we do next now?
We can test other benchmark. I think 5.1 is a sweet spot. With the latest Intel 9 Gen series CPU, we have a 9700K, we tested a 9900K. Can basically reach out between 5 to 5.3 depending on your CPU. Keep in mind every CPU is different, so even if you get something, your friend might not get exactly the same. It depends a lot on the motherboard that you use, the silicon lottery, we call that the lottery itself, because every CPU is different in terms of either manufacturing or things, even though they are the same products. But once you go beyond specification, nothing is guaranteed.
Cool. So now I think we're gonna stress test for a bit, see if we can get some true stability here, because it's always good after you've found some sort of value that gives you at least a little bit of stability to do a longer test.
Benchmark is easy for quick tests. You always need to test for your use case. Games, synthetic benchmark, like if you do video editing or photo editing, for example.
Before we wrap up everything Intel, we'll talk a little bit about the Extreme Tuning Utility program that we use, because actually every time you restart your computer, even if it's not a crash, like you just turn it off for the day, your settings will actually be reset to default, so they don't save in between like computer sessions.
So it will not save them into the BIOS. So every time you restart, it will be back to default. The way to go around that, there's two ways as well. So either you can save a profile within XTU and just launch it whenever you need, or if you want to have your overclock to be all the time like this, you have to make sure that it's stable. And you can set up into the BIOS. It's easy, just go into your BIOS, look in the manual, and look for the exact same names into the manual. So that's apply the same values, and that should be a stable overclock for yourself.
Keyword is stable. Make sure it's stable. Do extensive testing with the setup that you have in the Extreme Tuning utility. And once that's good to go and you're confident with that, you can probably head into the BIOS.
You save a lot of trouble, and it's much faster to do.
So, to wrap this up, let's look at our quick results. So in the scores we got in the Intel Extreme Tuning utility, base level, default settings, new PC, we're at 3099.
And after we switch XMP on and overclocked our 8 cores to 5.1, we end up being at 3353, which is a nice little boost in the end.
Big boost. That's a pretty solid boost.
I like it.
So for our use case, also we like to play a lot of games. So of course we want to test them with a few games. The default profile we had, new PC, in the Division we had about 111 FPS on average. And with our new overclocking profile and our slight little boost, we ended up at 114.4 FPS on average.
Little boost.
Little boost. The next game we looked at was Far Cry 5, and on the default PC, default settings, we had 116 FPS average. And with our boost, we ended up at 124.
And one of the good things to note is the minimum FPS was 91 on the default settings, and we went all the way up to 111 on the overclock PC, which is a nice things for fluidity.
Definitely a good boost. Big boost.
Little boost?
No, that was a big boost.
Big boost.
Big boost. And finally, we have For Honor. On the default settings, we ended up at about 191 FPS on average, and on our overclocking profile, we pretty much end up on the same FPS. But the most key thing to notice here is that on the default profile, the minimum FPS was about 92.5, but on the overclock profile, we're all the way up at 113.
So your minimum FPS in the game was much higher, which means it's a better experience.
We hope that gives you a bit more information about how you can pull out a little bit more performance from your hardware. What are the key takeaways for this?
Key takeaway for that are always test where you start from, which is very important. Increment step by step, don't go full out straight in. This usually will not work. And make sure you start easy and you learn as you go through. You will find more tweaks and more ways to do that to push your hardware even further. If any of you folks want to know more about performance testing, performance tuning, and overclocking, you can check out SkatterBencher's videos. I think the link will be in the description below as well. And Overclocking TV for easy to go tutorials.
Sweet. See you next time.
See ya.